Hello, and welcome to the third week of the Who Do You Think You Are module. This is the India Identity and Independence case study. This week, we're going to be picking up where we left off last time after the bloody events of the 1858 Sepoy Rebellion. And what is important to begin with this week is the difference between the East India Company's rule, which we were looking at last time, and the British Raj's rule. So, the East India Company was actually a private trading company that were given powers by the British government, but they weren't actually the British Parliament. And what happens after the 1858 rebellion is that British Parliament loses faith in the East India Company and strips it of all of its powers. So essentially, what happens in 1858 is the British government, as well as Queen Victoria, take over the rule of India. And that is what is known as the British Raj. Victoria officially becomes the empress, and the businessmen of the East India Company no longer have legislative power. And what happens after 1858? A strict series of new laws are introduced in India in an attempt to subdue the previously rebellious nation. What you have is the division of India into nearly 700 minor states. And the idea is that there is a strict bureaucracy that is established. And you have two types of states that are created. The first one, which is the majority of the country, is 500 British India states, which are primarily comprised of areas of the country which rebelled against the East India Company. Now you compare that to 175 states, which are called princely states, which were basically the middle class who were loyal to Britain, and they were given slightly more freedom as a reward for not rebelling against the British government. And if we look at those numbers, 500 British India states compared to 175 princely states, you can see that there was clearly a lot of support for the rebellion. But in this new system, you get new viceroys and secretaries of state, and they are tasked with trying to mend the broken relationship between Britain and the Indian population. And what essentially happens during the British Raj is a period of relative peace. There are some rebellious movements and some civil unrest, but generally speaking, Queen Victoria becomes a very popular figurehead with many people in India. Now, she never actually visits, which is a common misconception that she used to go there. She never went, but she did have a very popular and public friendship with someone called Abdul Karim, who was an attendant for the Queen and often visited her in Britain. And this made a lot of Indian people feel as though Queen Victoria cared more about Indian people and had more of a relationship with them than the members of the East India Trade Company. Under this time period, you see a physical change in the dress of many Indians who begin to take up Victoria's style of dress. And there are a lot of other positives that happened during the British Raj. So far, we've spoken a lot about the negatives, and I don't want you to think that the British did nothing for India or that there was no positive social change. When we think of gender rights in particular, the British Raj sees improvements to the lives of women and they gain more rights than they had previously. You get the abolition of the sati tradition, which is when a man dies, his wife would often put herself on top of his burning funeral pyre or was forced to die with him. And That was a tradition that was abolished by the Mughal dynasty originally. However, it was accepted under the East India rule. And then once again, under the British Raj, that is abolished. Although you still see some of these taking place in the western areas of India in particular. There is also a crackdown on crime and organised crime, and British intelligence fights a battle against a network of criminals, murderers, and rapists known as the Thugi, which is where the term thug comes from these days. And they are essentially hunted out and tried under strict new judicial systems. And the administrative systems and courts of Britain become much more westernized and punish gender based violence, as well as polygamy and child marriages. So there are a number of social issues that change, that improve the lives of women and children. However, some Indian historians have said that this is yet more examples of British cultural genocide. One of the most controversial topics in this time period is railways and infrastructure. Some historians see this as a positive, that under this time period, the British introduced extensive railway systems. And in fact, by 1870, India has the fourth most extensive railway system in the world. This improves India's ability to trade and has a very positive impact on the economy. However, other historians see this as yet more colonial oppression. Many of the trains were white only. They were owned by predominantly white companies, and many Indian nationals had no access to the trains. So, while some people see this as a positive, it is easy to see why others believe this to be a negative as well. But the economy, anyway, does get a boost as a result of the improved infrastructure of the country. And then finally, the widespread implementation of Western medicine, which had begun before the Raj but only increases after the Raj takes control, has an enormous impact on reducing infant mortality as well as increasing life expectancy. The first hospital was actually built before the Raj in Calcutta in 1835, but extensive medical centres and programs are introduced in Madras, Lahore, and in Patna after the Raj takes control of India. Books about anatomy, medicine, surgery, STD awareness, and vaccinations are all introduced throughout the country. Miscarriages are much less frequent during this time period. So people's standard of life and access to medicine increases as well. However, the number of positives that we talk about under the Raj are abruptly halted in the early 20th century after the outbreak of the First World War and then the subsequent Second World War. And after Britain enters the First World War in order to defend its economic trading partner, Belgium, from German invasion, it not only mobilizes the home front back in Britain, but it mobilizes the entire empire, including India. And as you can see on a number of the posters that were used to whip up popular support for the war, India and Indians were seen as crucial to the war effort. And the colonial armies were vast and numerous. Countries that Britain owned in Africa and Asia were all sent to different parts of the world to fight. The Indian colonial army contributed hundreds of thousands of soldiers, all who moved to Europe to fight in conditions that they had not been accustomed to. And after the First World War, many returned with severe mental health issues as a result of what they had seen. After, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the First World War and the details of it because I'll expand on that in the seminar. But after the First World War is concluded in 1918 and 1919, a lot there begins a new age of debate about the role of the colonial powers and their relationship between the countries they had colonized. And lots of countries who were administratively organized by the British government began to believe that they had earned the right to some new freedoms and autonomy as a result of the role they played during World War One. And the early 1920s and 30s see countries like Egypt, New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa all gain new levels of either complete independence or some form of political autonomy. However, that is not extended to India. And the introduction of the India Act in 1919, which was seen to reform the government of India and the Indian National Congress, is seen as an insult by many Indian nationals um, who believe that wider independence and greater autonomy should have been granted to them. And that's when you start to see um, disappointment and rebellion against the British return after that initial peace in during the British Raj. And the Punjab region in particular becomes a hotbed of revolt. Now, fearing another sepoy rebellion, the British respond to the new revolutionary vigor in India with strict and brutal measures once more. And in April 1919, there was something known as the Amritsar massacre, where only 50 British soldiers managed to kill between 300 and 1,000 civilians, depending on which sources you choose to believe. And this is in direct response to the peaceful movements of people like Mahatma Gandhi. And that's when you start to see widespread disillusionment with the British and how they conduct themselves. But this Indian nationalism that forms in this time period is not just a response to the British, but part of wider global national sentiments. Nationalism and xenophobia becomes incredibly popular throughout the globe in the late 20s and early 30s as a result of the economic crises of the First World War. And three countries in particular begin a violent expansionist program. The one that you'll most be familiar with is of course, Hitler and his expansion in Central Europe. But you also have Italy's Mussolini expanding into North Africa, and Emperor Hirohito of Japan and his brutal campaign against China, which is, of course, on the doorstep of India. And the League of Nations, which was a global peace process organization, failed to deal with any of these. So India's national movement is to be put in context among global nationalism. And these expanding empires eventually lead to conflict again, and Britain declares war on Germany and the Axis powers. And once more, Britain insists that the Indian people help fight the war effort. But this time, you're not talking about hundreds of thousands of Indians who join the British colonial army. You are talking millions. Over, but somewhere between 2 and 3 million Indian nationals are fighting throughout the globe on the side of Britain, and the deaths are staggering. But it's not just the men of India that Britain requires. They lend billions and take billions from the Indian economy, which halts the economic expansion that had been taking place. And they take control of food sources as well. And this leads to a series of devastating crises that happen in India. And that includes probably the most infamous of the crises, which is the Bengal famine, which takes place in the early 40s, where 2 million Indian nationals die of starvation, malaria, or malnutrition. And the tragedy about the Bengal famine is that it is widely considered that it was man made and completely avoidable. As a result of the war, inflation increased dramatically, meaning that Indians could no longer afford food, and the British took control of agricultural supplies as well, meaning that Indians who could afford the food no longer had access to it. There was also these issues were exacerbated by Japan's invasion of Burma, where they took control of huge stores of rice, and also there were a series of national disasters that took place, especially in the south. And the problem with this was Britain's response. Churchill refused to send relief efforts to India, and a lot of Indian people and the Indian National Congress felt completely abandoned by Britain during this time when Britain was asking so much of its nationals. And in fact, tens of thousands of Indians joined forces with Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany, believing that they were fighting an evil British oppressor. And as you can see on the top right, an Indian national proudly displaying the Nazi imperial insignia, that to many in India, Britain was hypocritical, imperial, and fascist. And one of the most famous nationals India have is a man called Subhas Chandra Bose, who joins the Indian National Army to fight against Britain. So I'm going to finish this session in this desperate moment of Indian history where 2 million people died avoidably whilst being forced to fight a war that the British had decided to become involved with. I've left the most important points on this conclusion side for you to make notes about. Now, in the seminar, I want you to think about 4 main questions that I'm going to ask you. 1, was the rule of the British Raj similar to the East Indian Company rule, or was it significantly different? Was it more defined by continuity or change? Secondly, were the British built railways that I spoke of a positive or a negative for India? And this is a hotly contested subject. Third, I want you to think about why were some British colonies granted freedom after World War I, but not India? Why didn't it gain the same independence as Egypt, say? Finally, I want you to think about, were Britain hypocritical during the Second World War? Were they actually comparable to Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan? Now, this isn't a question that has an easy answer or no correct answer, so hopefully we can have lots of discussion about that. And finally, to give you extra context on this issue, I want you to go away and read T.R. Sarin's Subhas Chandra Bose article, which is called Japan and British Imperialism. And that's found in the European Journal of East Asian Studies, Volume 3, Number 1, produced in 2004. And that's pages 69 to 97, available on JSTOR. And I look forward to discussing these incredibly complex issues with you in the seminar next week. Thank you.